This is a panel called Managing Point of View, and so if you're expecting something else, it will be elsewhere. All right, we're going to introduce ourselves. My name's Carol Berg. I'm the moderator of this panel, and I'm also an author. I write epic fantasy. My 15th book will be published on December the 1st by Penguin Putnam Rock Books. And I write, so maybe we'll just start and we'll do this, you know, in our intro. I write entirely from first-person point of view. All my novels are all epic fantasy. And in fact, I've written like 3 short stories now, which is for me. And, you know, because I usually throw out that many words. When I revise a novel, and so I didn't think you could tell a whole story in like just that many, a few thousand words. But you know, I've done that. But all those are for first person as well. So I'm going to be talking about that. So, but let's start down at this end and have everybody introduce themselves.
I'm John Barnes. The tagline I've been using lately is that I am a very widely published obscure writer. I've gotten paid for about 5 million words in my life, and I have 30-some books out. But most recently of those was in 2013 because I have periods of several years at a time when I just don't finish anything. And then suddenly have a couple of years when I finish things every couple of months, and I'm hoping to start one of those real soon. Meanwhile, though, most of my stuff's older. One of my many checkered occupations has been a book doctor. Specifically, book doctors used to be hired by publishers and agents rather than by writers. And the job was, if a book came in that was usually something they'd already paid for and it just wasn't quite publishable and the author couldn't get it there, then that was the book doctor's job was to kick it over the line, basically, one way or another. So it was taking somebody's baby and mutilating it. And I've done that.
POV.
Yeah, and point of view stuff has come, comes into that quite a bit.
Hillary?
Okay. I'm Hillary Bell, and I write children's and young adult science fiction and fantasy. And I have written first person, third person, and I am currently doing a multi-path choose your own adventure style novel in the second person, which I would never otherwise write. I have written single protagonists, I have written two POV protagonists, I have written 3 POV protagonists. I haven't done a cast of thousands type protagonists thing, but aside from that, I think I've pretty much done all of it at this point.
Okay.
Hey guys, thanks for coming. 5 o'clock on Friday, you guys rock. I'm Amelie Howard. I'm a young adult author. I've written 8 books. I'm published with Harlequin Teen, Skyhorse, and Angry Robot Books. I primarily write in first person and third person. I mean, first person is pretty popular with young adults just because it immerses you in the experience. But I enjoy writing from third person just because you can talk about different secrets and you don't have to experience through one person in the book. I did have a friend who wrote a book from second person and it was incredible. And I never thought I'd like it, but the one thing that will tell you if someone has written a point of view well is whether you feel you don't feel anything like negative. You're so drawn into the experience that you finish the book and you're like, wow, that was in second person, didn't even know it. Suzanne Collins, you wouldn't even have thought that she wrote that book in first person when, years ago. And she did, and it was incredible. Present tense, which was great.
Okay.
I'm Scott Backman. I'm a self-published author of an epic fantasy novel. In the process of going through that, a lot of you guys are probably beginning authors. I imagine that's why you're here. You're interested in learning about writing. So part of the whole process of going through my book was wrote the entire thing in first person and finished it, and then realized that was just a crap way to do it, and totally rewrote it in third person. So I've definitely struggled with point of view. And then I'm in the process of writing several more books, but primarily all in third person.
Okay. Well, we have, there's a slew of questions we can be talking about tonight because point of view is a huge topic. I've seen half-day workshops given on point of view, and you still run out of time before you can talk about everything. a lot of people think that point of view is a bunch of rules, and why do I have to stick to rules? And so I think maybe just let's start out with one of the questions that was proposed for this panel was, any story can be told from any point of view. What impact does first person, limited third, multiple third, or multiple first, and what exactly are those? So let's start out by sort of giving a quick definition of what first person, limited third, multiple third, or multiple first, what those are, and what, maybe we could, not all explain all of them. We don't have to do that because there's too many things to talk about. And what, why do you feel like your third person is the point that you chose, and why, why you feel, that which one do you like and which one do you naturally fall into? Let's sort of go at that, and not each of us try to cover everything, all of them. So why don't you start, because
Sure.
you obviously you tried and you decided this one is one for me.
Right, so I knew that my book was being told by multiple main characters, right? So the idea with writing in first person was that it was all, I was trying to be too creative. I was trying to say that it was all journal entries by my various main characters, interspersed with journal entries by random other people in different parts of the world, so I could explain different things. And for me at least, that was interesting, but ultimately then you've got characters that have to keep journals, and they have to be the kind of people that keep journals. And that wasn't the kind of characters that I had. And so I ran into a roadblock there right away, where going in third person, multiple third person, enabled me to just say, no, I'm just going to write this chapter from this one character's point of view. I'm going to switch over, write the next chapter from this person's point of view, and there's nothing holding me back from switching over, having a miscellaneous chapter from some random other character I just made that's point of view. So it gave me a lot of freedom to jump around the world however I wanted to, and to really make my characters themselves, and not have to imagine what is my character like when he's inside his own head, or if he's writing his thoughts down. So anyway, that's how I ended up with multiple third person.
Okay.
I kind of empathize, because I wrote this story that I'm on submission with right now, and it's epic fantasy, and it was in the first person, 2 characters, and I went, each of them, was in first person chapter to chapter. The problem with that you get is voice. It has to be very distinctive. If you have a voice that sounds even remotely similar, readers are going to pick up on it, and it's just going to start washing for them. For me, an example is, Maggie Stiefvater, she wrote Shiver, and she did a great job of putting, different voices from, the male character to the female character. I found that I was not able to sort of overcome that hurdle. So I went through and did it all in third person, and it was awful. It was so hard, but I think it made the book way better. Primarily, I was told when I started writing for YA, which was about 6-7 years ago, that young adults like reading in the first person because, as I in my introduction, I said it's very immersive. A young adult reader can just put themselves in it. It's first person. They learn as you go. You find out what the different plot points are in the story. Whereas with third person, you can have multiple characters and a plot setup where they're coming from different directions, and by the end of your story, they meet and they intersect. So it's just a different sort of journey it takes you on, in my opinion.
Okay, when I started writing, I wrote for about 8 or 9 years, just for fun. I was a software developer, and I started writing fantasy novels just as a hobby, as my kids started getting older. And one of the first manuscripts I was working on, I couldn't figure out why I couldn't seem to feel this story the way I felt the stories, the books that were on my shelf. And I was writing in third person. So third person is he, she, right? Where it's told from, George walked up the steps. He stumbled because he'd been drinking that night. You can be, if it's limited, if it's close in third, you're in his head. But he's referred to as George or he throughout it. First person is, of course, I. It's the I perspective. It's someone who's telling this story, and you're in that person's head throughout the narrative part of of the story. And as Emily said, that means that the narrative voice is the voice of that person. It's the internal monologue of that person whose head you're in. But I was trying to write from the third, because so many books you read are from the third, and I just hadn't given it a thought. But I couldn't figure out, until finally I said, you know, every book that I love is first person. Why am I not trying that? And what I did is I just went through and I sort of translated he to I and him to her or whatever. And it comes kind of awkward. You can't just do a straight transfer. But I tried it. And I read it and it was like stiff as a board. There was no voice there. There was no feel there. Because when you're in close third, the narrative should be in that person's style as well. Because you're in that person's point of view. These are the eyes through which you see the events of the story. And so what I realized is that I totally rewrote it because it was so stiff sounding, and all of a sudden it flowed, and all of a sudden I felt like I was much closer to that story. And I had no idea that there were people who despised first person until I published mine, and somebody said, like you referred to, I didn't even realize it was first person for a long time, because I usually hate first person narratives. And so I realized that was a compliment. And so I got, as I got more and more comfortable writing in those years where I was sort of doing my own little choose your own profession thing, I realized that all of a sudden when I got into, all of a sudden I realized how to really get into a person's head. And that was actually the earliest written of my books that was published is called Song of the Beast. And that was when all of a sudden I realized I got it, that I understood what I was doing. We're going to talk a little bit, I think we'll have another topic in a minute about the problems with writing in any particular point of view. So I won't go into that right now. We'll go to Hillary and see what she likes to write.
Actually, I'm very comfortable with either first or third. Those are the two natural storyteller voices when you think about it. I went to the store today and it was so crowded and I couldn't find a parking place, and yet a story about you. You know, let me tell you about my Aunt Helen. She was so crazy, she just... Third, depending on if you're talking about yourself or another person when you're telling the story. And that's why, you know, both of these choices actually work really well for things that aren't literary experiments. I have some prejudice against second person, but which is not a natural storyteller voice unless you're giving directions. But one of the things that I've kind of found choosing between first and third is that it depends a little on how much character your character has. If you have a really distinctive, interesting voice, then first person can be a really good way to go because it lets that character's voice out more. If your character's voice is kind of ordinary and run-of-the-mill, you're probably better off writing it in third person, because if you're writing in first person and your protagonist's voice is fairly ordinary and run-of-the-mill, it's really boring. And in third person, somebody with a more ordinary voice can actually work a lot better. And if you're writing in close third person, and people say, oh, first person is so much more immediate, but really I think if you're writing in close third person, if you're in that character's head and in their emotions, whether you're saying he or I doesn't make that big a difference, I don't think.
I'll just throw out that there, a generation or so ago, there used to be it used to be acknowledged there's two meanings of the first, second, and third person. There's the grammatical one that pretty much everybody uses because you all have that thumped into you in 7th and 8th grade, and that's pretty much what has taken over. But there was an older tradition of referring to first person as being the viewpoint of the protagonist, of the character who drives the plot, second person usually being somebody standing close to them, and third person being basically the God's eye view.
Really?
And I have noticed that one thing that will very often perk up interest in a story is, as a general rule, try not to have those two line up. As a general rule, the protagonist is so close to the action, you know, the person who's driving the action, but also because there's, you know, there's a lot less suspense and so forth. If you're really good, you can break any rule, but in general, you can juice a book up some by doing that. The second, you know, the great second-person narrators, the people who are actually kind of fascinate me because they're often better characters than the protagonist. Watson is a lot more interesting than Holmes. You know why Holmes does what he does, but you'll never figure out why Watson follows him around. Ishmael, Horatio, you know, I mean, you know, sort of in classic literature, it's amazing how often the story is in the plot second.
Yeah, that would be very distinct about that, because in common terms, when we're talking about second-person point of view, that means it's you.
Yeah.
It's, as you say, the sort of choose-your-own-adventure kind of, you know, you walk down the stairs, you do this, you do this. It's directly addressing the reader, and speaking of, you do this. And there's a few literary things. What was it? Usually I can think
Bright
of
Lights, Big City.
Bright Lights, Big City was written in that second-person point of view. And this idea of the person, it's who is the eyes of your point of view. Whose eyes are you looking at the events through? And so I think that's a good segue to how do you choose whose eyes you see the story from? And before we do that, I want to mention one other, when people talk about the omniscient point of view, the word was fluttering around here. The omniscient point of view it means you're not looking through any particular person's eyes at your story. It's more that it could be the author, it could be a storyteller, you know.
Can I think real quick?
Absolutely.
Because there's a lot of confusion about omniscient point of view being a whole bunch of POV characters. And that's not the same thing. You know, you can have multiple POV characters and stay distinct in their head. True omniscient, you're simultaneously in everybody's head and nobody's head. An example that the three children stood looking at the package the stranger had left on their porch. We shouldn't open it until Mom comes home, Katie says, feeling virtuous. Katie said, feeling virtuous. Tommy just wanted to get into it. He didn't care if Mom came home or not. And the little baby didn't care at all. She was just attracted by the bright bows. Inside the box, the bomb ticked down. Okay?
Great.
Yeah. We're in nobody's head. We know that there's a bomb in the box, even though that nobody knows about it. That's genuine omniscient point of view, and it's very distancing from the character. You almost never see anything but a short story in true omniscient.
Unless you read classics. Because oftentimes classic literature, Victorian literature, was told from this omniscient point of view.
But really, it's like you're looking at the story through binoculars. You're so far away from the people almost.
Yes.
Even the Ring Lardner, great short story writer, demonstrating how fast can you change point of view within a few words. One of his classic sentences, and he tends to be known for his sentences, was, "I will certainly do it," she said, meaning that she would. "I understand," he said, knowing she wouldn't.
There you go.
Wow.
Yeah, but that's really hard to do.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to this. How do you choose who your point of view character is? How do you choose whose eyes you are going to look at these events through? You're talking about looking through a lot of different people's eyes. Why do you choose a lot of people instead of a few people, for example?
I mean, for mine, it was largely plot-based. I knew that there were events going on in two different sides of the world that I had to be telling the story at the same time, so it just made sense to have a character that's involved on either side. So for me, it was as easy as that. It was as easy as the plot drove my decision making.
Okay, and so that's how you chose exactly who that person was? How did you choose, if you have two people over here on this side of the world, how did you choose which of them?
Right, and I think that was it's difficult to balance, like the omniscience factor and the POV with when you have multiple characters, particularly in a scene where you think both of them are relatively important. You know which one is your main character, but you've got other characters that are relatively important, and you'd love to be able to say what it is that they're thinking and feeling, and there's always a pull to want to just come right out and say that. So sticking with one POV is pretty tough. For me, I mean, I think that my book, a lot of the way that I approached doing multiple POV was, or multiple characters, was Game of Thrones driven, so I knew that each character is named after the character that is being told from their point of view. So it was easier for me to kind of go back to that, and for my editor to consistently point me back to that, about whose POV it really is, to make sure that it's their perception of events that's driving things, rather than, I mean, there are instances when you can change, like you're saying, you can change mid-chapter, you can absolutely adjust whose POV you're going through, but the transition can be difficult, and it takes a lot of work and finesse. For me, it was much easier just to decide, hey, this chapter is this person, and to just run with that and edit for that, and to stay strict to it.
For me, it's a combination of timing and story. When I first started writing, I wanted to write what I read, which was primarily fantasies in third person, so that's what I started writing. Those were my first few books, were in third person past tense. And then as I wrote more, I decided to try first person present, which my last few books are in. And then that, of course, is driven by story. And since I have, with contract deals, when I wrote this, Alpha Goddess was one of my first written books, but it came out in 2014. I now have to write the sequel, so I have to take myself out of my first person writing, which I'm doing right now, and flip back to third person past. And it's difficult because when you're telling a story from 2 points of view, one, you have to make sure that that you tell the story in such a way that you're not just dumping on the reader. You want them to experience both sides. And for me, with Alpha Goddess and this sort of story, which is like Indian mythology, I wanted to have one point of view character represent the light, and then one point of view character represent the dark, and they intersect at points in the story, which is, I think, interesting, an interesting correlation for the reader. So, factor of plot, also just what I, when I write, what I started writing and what I write now, which is primarily present, first person present tense.
So how do you choose who?
I mean, I think it's just a factor of the story. I mean, this book about on my Underwater Dragon series, it's about this girl who she finds out that she's the queen of this species that lives in the Earth's oceans, and she doesn't want to be queen. She runs away to the human world. The whole experience of her sort of finding herself and saying, I have to defend my people from these awful humans who are polluting the world. I wanted the reader to sort of insert themselves in her and discover each aspect of it as she discovers it. Whereas with, the other example, I wanted, with the third person point of view, gave me the chance of coming at the story from different directions. Okay. Light, dark, intersection. So, I mean, I decided before I wrote it, except that example I gave before where I wrote that story in first person in it, just because because that's two. First person one chapter, first person another chapter, and it was awful. My voice was just mixing. So you have to be very careful to make sure that it's very distinct.
Okay, we will talk about voice in a minute, because understanding what voice really means is, because there's an author's voice and there's a persona voice, which is the voice of your point of view character, and then it's voice of your other characters when they speak in dialogue. So we'll talk about that a little bit.
I mean, a good example is Twilight, right? Everybody has a relationship with Twilight where you hate it, love it, whatever. And I always thought that Bella was such a weak person. And then somebody told me Bella is written in such a way that any girl can put themselves inside her and live her story. And I was just like, wow. If she really thought that when she was writing, that's brilliant. That's what you want. And, well, you don't know. You know what I mean? And it was interesting to me to hear that. Yeah. Because I was so oh, she's not strong.
Yeah. Well,
I would actually argue that, though, because if you try to write a character, most people, if they set out to write a character that anyone can relate to, end up writing a character that has no character at all.
Well, maybe that was purpurposeful. That's what I was saying. I just found it interesting.
And I don't necessarily think that anybody can. I thought she had a decent voice. I read the first 3/4 of Twilight, and then I bogged down because there wasn't enough action. But I thought she had a decent voice, at least than the 3/4 of the first novel. But yeah, I actually would say don't try to write a novel that anyone can envision themselves in, because you're writing about nobody.
Write a good story with good, interesting people in it. And the way I always start, every one of my projects starts with an idea about a person in a situation. And I don't know always where that story is going to go. But then I try. Only one of my stories actually started with a situation in the world, a world on a brink of an environmental disaster and in the middle of a civil war, to see who succeeds a very noble king. And that particular one, I didn't really understand the story until I had an image. I read a lot about stories about the world on the brink of a dark age. So I read a lot about that, and the story didn't come alive for me until I had this image of a really tall young man lying prostrate on the floor of an abbey church, as if he's going to take holy orders. And this is certainly, you know, a medieval time period. And he, as he was there in the process of doing this, he's saying, "What the hell am I doing here?" And all of a sudden the story came alive for me. So of course he was the protagonist whose point of view, and he told the story of how he happened to be abandoned he had deserted from a battle, and he was abandoned in the mud outside this monastery, and he got taken in there, and all he had was this book of maps, because his buddy stole everything that was valuable, except he knew that this happened to be valuable. But and he became, you know, one of my most favorite of all my characters. But that's how I choose, and that's how I wanted to be in his head, and I wanted to know why he was doing. He doesn't tell everything at first, but it unfolds as the events unfold. I had another book, actually my first published book is a book called Transformation, and that's a book where I had this image of a prince of a desert empire riding across the desert with the sand rolling up behind him. And I said, this is somebody who's arrogant, who sees the world laid out in front of him. He knows exactly what he's going to do. And but I know he's so callous and he's so arrogant, but he has a great destiny, which I didn't know what was. And I said, a person like that is not introspective. Because what I wanted to tell is how he sort of fell from grace and was changed into somebody who was worthy of the destiny that I hadn't figured out yet. And so, so I decided that he couldn't tell his own story. I decided I wanted somebody that had to be around him all the time so they could observe this change in him, this transformation in him. And it makes it more interesting if the person who's telling the story has no reason to like this person. And so I decided that the person who told the story was going to be a slave. And he was somebody that this prince would go, and that told me where their meeting place was on the day the prince bought this slave. And he bought him to write for him, because the princes of the Derzi Empire, they don't write or read. You know, that's useful things, but they don't do that. And so he needed somebody to write for him. And so I have this person, and to tell the story. And as I started writing, all of a sudden I realized that the slave was actually more important than the person he was telling me about. And that's the wonders to me of writing in the way I do, because that's how my ideas come to me. But you can take yourself in interesting places. You have to consider who, you know, you automatically think, oh, well, my point of view character is going to be my protagonist. It's going to be the person who this story is about, who's the main actor in this. But it's not necessarily, and sometimes it could have worked out where the slave wasn't truly the more important person, but it could have, you know, it could have gone either way, and it just happened. But of course the problem came, and I'll talk about the problem in a minute when we talk about problems, but that's sort of how I choose who my eyes are.
kind of a rule of thumb, particularly when you're first starting out, is that your protagonist should be the person who grows and changes the most over the course of the story. The person with the biggest character arc. Although there can be exceptions to that, but that's kind of more advanced stuff. But one point kind of about using multiple POV protagonists is that if you're going to have 2 or 3 more or less co-equal protagonists, each one of them has to have a character arc within the same story. So if you're going to have two big protagonists, be aware that they both have to have character arcs and they both have to be pretty equal in intensity in terms of the character arc. One common mistake people make is they have one really big character and then a couple of lesser characters that are just kind of hanging around, filling in places that they kind of wanted to get information to the reader, but they were too lazy to have the hero learn it. Yeah, if you're going to have more than one POV protagonist, they all have to be pretty much equal in terms of importance to the story, and they've all got to have a character arc.
3 good tricks, as quick as I can make to give them. 1, if you become good at point of view, one of the things that you eventually can do is use it to characterize the point of view character, because what they look at, what they see, how they describe it, what they notice, gives you a really deep view of what kind of person they are.
I don't think that's if you become good at it. I think that's essential.
Yeah.
Well, there are an awful lot of books out there that manage to get published without actually paying much attention to them. 2, it is a really good idea to use close point of view if you are writing about sort of, for lack of a better word, the kind of action-adventure world, the world of commandos and spies and explosions and so forth, because these are people who, one way or another, if you're being realistic, do not express themselves very much. So this way you get somebody's feelings into it. Otherwise, otherwise everybody's going to be talking like a cop on the radio, you know. And so that's a really important trick there. And kind of the third one is think a lot about how far back you want your character to stand, because it's a big part of their nature. You know, think about all the second bananas. Thanks to Arthur Conan Doyle, lots and lots of detectives are followed around by some blabbermouth who actually tells the story. And in some cases, that person stays very far away. In other cases, they're right on top of them. And there's always a reason. It's usually a complicated one. So kind of think about how close do you want somebody standing to the story.
Okay. We will take questions, but let's give about 5 minutes more to the panel here.
I think to what Hillary was saying before, some authors don't. You can have multiple points of view. Like, so Cassandra Clare does it particularly well. She has 6 points of view in her book, but they each have different weights. You have like the 2 main ones, and then you have 4 others that, you know, support in some way. So it's not necessarily 6 character arcs that are equivalent. They're all different, but you have the 2 main ones, and then you have supporting ones. And I mean, she does a great job at it. I don't know if I can manage 6 POVs. I've done 3.
If you do that, though, I think you're getting more into limited POV and what I kind of call cast of thousands.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, people like David Weber and Eric Flint have like bazillions of POV characters in their story, some of whom you'll only see for a scene. And when you're writing that, and it sounds like your author is kind of between the two, when you're writing that, though, you're telling less the story of any person and more the story of a war or a historical event or an alternate historical event. Mm-hmm. And if it's the story of an event, then you can have a cast of thousands. But again, be aware that every time you switch POV, you're lessening the reader's emotional connection to the story. So,
yeah,
very good.
I want to, I'd like to continue that a little bit. In that, oh God, I lost the thought. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm just going to disagree with Hillary, because maybe we can turn it into an ugly brawl up here and you'll all be more entertained. But
I'll argue it.
Yeah, but there are times. Some very, very good writers who write in cast of thousands viewpoints do it entirely so they can stay in the head of whoever has the most at stake. The best example of that I know is Michael Sherr's The Killer Angels,
Yes.
which is Gettysburg,
Yes.
in which you are always in the head of the person who is having the most important change out of a cast of close to 500,000.
Yes, and then
Well,
then
yeah,
Jack
but I
Sherrick
think it's
doing
the point of view.
Yeah.
You were speaking of the point of view cast of thousands
Yeah.
rather than.
But you're, well,
To me,
yeah,
that's
but
what
it-
I like to write. Is I write the story. I write epic fantasy. I write the story of great events, but I like to write it through what I call a very personal lens. So I am with this person throughout these great events, and it's the person who has a lot at stake and whose character arc is shaped by these great events, and yet I keep this very personal connection to it rather than standing back here and telling the story of this environmental disaster and this, battle for the throne. It's how it affects this person. That's how I tell that story, because to me, the story of another battle, the story of another struggle for the throne, that's been done many times, but it's never been through the eyes of sort of a drug addict, a guy who is described in a review of Flesh and Spirit about a drug-addicted Merlin. And that's sort of who he is, and somebody who's run away from his life the whole time, run away from his life since he was 15, and he gets caught back up into who is he really and how does he fit in the world, against the background of what I hope are some very interesting and difficult world events. The trick, I tend to agree with Hillary about the weight of the person, because one of the criticisms I got for one of my, actually the earliest book of mine that I wrote, even though it was published fourth, was that I brought in a second point of view, because I decided, I have this, it's a musician who's been imprisoned for 17 years, and he doesn't know why. He was imprisoned at the height of his career, and he has no idea why he was thrown into prison. And when he's released from prison, he's dead inside, and he can't sing anymore. And so I was telling the story from his point of view, and about 2/3 of the way through the book, I said, I've got to have somebody from the other people, the people who are chasing him and trying to kill him, and who, trying to do all this. I have to have somebody from there speak, and to show, have him interact with this person. And it was too late in the book. It was too late in the book to bring in a new point of view. It probably would have been a much stronger book if I had kept in his head, because what I discovered with my first one about the prince and the slave, that the slave was a much more important figure, and it turned out that the other two books that grew out of that first one, he told, and the second one, the prince was only in a small amount, and the third was, but they were both in that one, but that it was this huge character arc of which this first story was only a piece. And what happened was that I got through, and I told all of those from this single first person point of view, and I got to within about probably, the climax of the third book, and I realized I'd written myself into a corner where this person who had told this whole story was going to do something to himself that would completely remove the person he had been for 2 2/3 books. And I said, I cannot change the point of view here, because the person, readers have made this personal connection. They've been in his head, they've been in his emotion, they've ridden through this huge bunch of events. And here it would be cheating if all of a sudden I said, now I'm going to observe him from somebody else's point of view. And it was one of the most challenging pieces of writing I ever did, but it also was one of the most rewarding, because I had to figure out how for him to keep telling the story when he was not himself anymore. And it came out, and of course what you do is you start thinking, how do you get, because a lot of people will say, if you're writing in first person point of view, nobody ever sees him, nobody can ever describe him, you don't know, anything that person doesn't admit about himself, You never know it, but you do, because it's the dialogue, it's the interaction with
And
the
the way
characters.
people react to it.
The
yeah.
way people react, when people say, "Where are you? You're not the person I knew." And that's what can make a story richer even than what you planned. Anybody want to say anything else before we take some questions?
We can take questions.
Questions? All right. Yes.
How do you feel about books that, or is it even possible to have multiple types of POV in the same book, like switching from first person to third person?
Yeah, I actually
Sounds
have
good.
that.
Yeah. I'm actually just finishing A Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss, and that's exactly what it is. He's bouncing back and forth between third person and first person views, with the main character telling his story in first person, and then bouncing back to a real world, a real, the actual timeline that he's telling the story in third person. And yeah, I think that Patrick Rothfuss uses it a lot to build a lot of mystery, where there's an understanding that's kind of underlying it, that he's only telling its potential, but he's only really telling parts of the story that he wants people to know. So it builds this enormous mystery over the most of the book that you're reading, to say, is any of this accurate, or is it just the way that he's presenting it? And when you get glimpses into the third person world, to kind of explain that, right? To kind of say, maybe it's not really how it's going, right? So he uses it super effectively.
I would add though that if you're going to mix them, you want to have a reason why you're doing it, and you really want to be sure it serves that reason. Because if you're not going to do it really well, I think it could be very distracting.
Although it's always fair that your reason be because it's just interesting. I mean, you know,
Sure.
that's,
Yeah.
you know, that's always an okay reason.
I've read one where that was done as well, and what the problem that I had with it in the one that I read, I know anything can be done well, as you say, and it sort of vanishes into the free impact of the story. But one of the things I felt like it was purposefully done to cheat. It was purposely done because it was first person point of view, and it was a close third person point of view, but it wasn't all that close. So there was a lot of hiding going on. If you find yourself choosing a point of view because it's so I can not reveal something, or so I can explain something to the reader, or that's one of the things, I think that's not necessarily the legitimate reason for choosing a point of view. You want the best thing for your story, and you can do a lot of things. Just because you're telling first person point of view doesn't mean that you know everything, that everything spills, you know, the guts spill out on the page, because there's a lot of things we don't know about ourselves. You can have somebody whose internal narrative is going in one direction, making certain assumptions. You know, one of my characters, he believes he's a party guy. He has a great time. He thinks he has friends all over. And it's at the end of the second book of 2 that he admits that he never really had a friend. He didn't even understand what they were. And so that's got to be your skill as writer to bring that off. So think about the reasons why you're choosing different points of view. It would have been very easy for me to swap when poor Sayong had, you know, turned himself inside out. But by trying to sort of think of the rule and think of how unhappy a reader was going to be all of a sudden to be lopped out of this man's head, if they'd stuck with it that far, that led me to work harder at the writing.
You also don't want it to be too contrived, right? You're writing to create a story for people to read and enjoy. If it becomes contrived, people aren't gonna read you. I mean, there's a book, I love Rainbow Rowell. She's an awesome writer, contemporary, but she has like a little story within her story. I think a Fangirl's the book. I think it's Fangirl. And I was skimming over the parts I didn't want to read, but I was so caught up in the bigger story that I just, you know, and that's just one book, but, you know, I mean, there are lots of authors who do it and do it well, and you're just as caught up in both, you know, as Scott was saying earlier.
Okay. Another question?
Emily, when, is that how you say your name?
Emily, yeah.
Emily. Okay, when your two protagonists collide, did you find that challenging to mix their point of views when they were together?
You know, that's a great question, because it is hard when you're in someone's head to make sure that you aren't explaining things or feeling things from the other person, and it's difficult. You have to like go through, and sometimes, I mean, a copy editor and an editor are good for those things to notice, hey, you've slipped out of POV here. Or, but yeah, it's definitely something when you bring them together that you have to make sure that if you're writing from, say, I'll say, just say for, you know, just for argument's sake, the girl and the boy, if you're writing from the girl's perspective, that you stay in her POV. Because it's, any little shift is going to be jarring to your reader, and you don't want that. You want them to stay in, you know, the perspective that you're writing that chapter from, or whatever the scene is. But you know, a good editor will make sure. I mean, I'm going through it right now where people have put notes in the margins. My editor has said, you've slipped out of POV, just make sure and correct it. And I mean, in the old romance world, I don't know if there are any, well, it's a sci-fi and fantasy convention, but in the old romance world, they slipped in between like POVs all the time. You had like a love scene, it was like guy and girl and guy and girl and guy. Yeah, you can't do that.
That's still done. It's still done in romance.
Oh, it's totally done, yeah, I know.
It's part of romance.
But romance is the one place where you do see head hopping.
Yeah, all the time.
Romance. And I think that actually the reason that people can get by with it in romance is because it's usually in love scenes. It's
Oh, yeah,
always in love scenes where the two main
Why not?
characters are so focused on each other and what they're doing with each other that moving back and forth between their heads kind of works. But just about any place else, no, an editor
Yeah, it's
will
totally
nail you
frowned
for
on.
head hopping.
My first book, which was like vampires and witches, and there's a love element in it. Yeah, they were like, no, you can't do that. Okay.
One of the things I found that when you're writing multiple points of view, because I do have books that are written in multiple first-person points of view, but I try to make not just chapter by chapter, certainly not scene by scene, but a section where it's very clear to the reader whose section this is. But one of the things I found that it's really fun, because people say, oh, well, then you only see events from one perspective. You only, do this, that as a problem of first-person point of view. But you can write multiple first-person points of view effectively. And what I try to do is never show an entire scene from two different points of view, but I show them overlapping. If I have someone, your first person point of view, experience this scene and he has his reactions to it, and he goes and does it, and then all of a sudden, a little later on, you see this same scene from the perspective of a different character. I would always add material to it so there's something new in the scene, not just the point of view, but that there's actually new material, and you see other things happening before, after, during, and of course you have this person's reactions to it. And again, that's a challenging thing, but for a writer to do that, but not just repetition, but to have this overlap, and you get that same the same effect that you can with multiple third person points of view.
I was going to say, your job as a writer is to advance the plot.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, if you're doing the same scene from different POVs, you really need to be sure that the second POV tells you enough that's completely different than the first POV to make up for the fact that you have totally stopped the forward momentum of your story.
That's right.
Head hopping is often a good way to deal with the problem that people plan and think, especially if you write intrigue type novels. I'm speaking as a book doctor who cured more than a dozen such books. Like, the mark of the writer who isn't quite there yet is that they give you the whole scene where they plan the operation and then they start the operation.
All right, we have like 1 minute. Okay, so I would like to go through really fast and just have your one important piece of advice on the topic of point of view. Real quick, because we've just got a moment. So start at this end.
Oh, don't take it too terribly seriously. It just happens to be something that an awful lot of writers and editors are able to say things about, so it gets more attention than it deserves.
I would actually, okay. Maybe we should have a panel and just argue with each other. I would have to say take it very seriously. Okay, I'm sorry. The POV character is the thing that your reader is going to associate with most. The POV character is the person that you're the POV creator is your story, to all intents and purposes. And if your POV character isn't working, your story will not work. Okay?
So maybe just, I'll go between them and say experiment with it. Like I think I learned a lot trying to write my story from first person, discovering that that didn't work, right? It still helped me flesh out characters. And there's nothing wrong with just, especially when you're starting out, writing a bunch of words. Like there's nothing wrong with just writing a ton and finding out that that doesn't work. It's still a great experience, and it helps you find your voice.
Okay. Yeah, I'm totally with Scott. He totally stole what I was going to say. You know, just follow your story. It's really just finding your story and telling your story. And if it's not authentic and it's not working, switch it up. Try something different. See if that works. And I mean, for me, it was always about writing what I love to read. So if something inspires you and you're excited about, you know, writing something that's in a similar voice, do it.
Mine would be not to shy away from a difficult point of view or a different, you know, a difficult protagonist to speak from. Just remember that when you're in a first-person point of view or when you're in a close third-person point of view, that the narrative is in that person's voice, in their persona, every bit as much as it's not just for dialogue. That it's the storytelling is from that person's point of view as well. So he should see what this person would see. He should react to what this person, your point of view character, should react to.
And don't do what Veronica Roth did. Start a series and then put double point of view in the last book because you know something bad's going to happen.
All right, thank you. All right.